This is the easier-to-read version of 1984 by George Orwell, retold and narrated by Sarah Simpson. Part 1, Chapter 1. It was a sunny, cold day in April. The clocks all over the city were striking 13. Winston Smith hurried into the lobby of his apartment in the Victory Mansions building. He was trying to get out of the cold wind as quickly as possible. It was ironic that the apartment building used the word mansions because all of the apartments were small, dirty, and smelled terrible, like boiled cabbage and dirty carpet. Winston wished the elevator worked, but he knew better than to even try. It was always broken. Even if the elevator weren't broken, he knew he wouldn't be able to use it right now. The electricity was turned off for everyone in the city during the daytime. The government was saving energy, so there would be enough electrical power for Hate Week, a huge celebration coming up soon. Winston lived on the 7th floor. He was only 39 years old, but he had to stop to rest every few steps. He had a painful varicose vein on his leg, just above his right ankle. It was swollen and purple and hurt all the time, but there wasn't much he could do about it. A doctor could have fixed it easily, but poor people like Winston couldn't get in to see a doctor for months. He'd just have to suffer. On every floor of the building, there was a huge color poster of a man's face with the words, "Big Brother is watching you," beneath it. The man in the posters was about 45 years old and handsome. He had a thick black mustache. The posters were so big they could have been used as billboards outside, and they took up the entire wall. Winston barely even noticed the posters. He was used to them. They were hanging everywhere he went. Big Brother was always watching him. When Winston went into his apartment, he could hear the telescreen. As always, it was something about how great the government was and how wonderful life was for everyone in Oceania. He dimmed the brightness down as far as it would go and turned down the volume as low as it would go. Winston hated having the telescreen on all the time, but the government put one in every apartment, and it could never be turned off. Turning off the telescreen was against the law. You could get in big trouble if the government found out you had somehow shut it off. Winston stood by the window. It was small and filthy and barely let in any light, but it was the closest thing to nature he had. The city outside was ugly and dirty. Winston didn't look much better. He was thin and so pale he looked sick. He had limp, pale hair and looked older than 39. His skin was rough from using the harsh government-issued soap and razors, and from never getting outside in the sun. He wore the same blue overalls as all the other party members. Across the street, hanging from the front of a house, was another poster of the handsome man with the black mustache. Big Brother is watching you. He heard a helicopter flying somewhere in the distance. It was the police patrol flying around to look in people's windows to be sure nobody was doing anything the government didn't want them to do. Winston wasn't worried about the police patrol. It was the thought police he needed to worry about. The voice on the telescreen kept talking. It was something about how successful the latest 3-year government plan had been. It was the 9th 3-year plan Winston could remember. Supposedly, all of them had been a huge success. Winston was vaguely aware that, if all these plans had been successful, life in Oceania should be much better. However, he knew better than to actually say something like that out loud. Saying something like that could get you arrested by the thought police. Winston felt himself shiver just thinking about it. Winston looked over his shoulder at the telescreen. It was always playing, but it was also always watching. There was a camera inside of the telescreen that watched everything you did. Somewhere in Oceania, someone was watching him. You had to be careful not to do anything that could be taken out of context that might look illegal. Winston didn't like the idea that someone was watching him, so he kept his face turned away from the screen. However, he had to be careful not to do that too much. He didn't want to look like he was trying to hide something. From the window, Winston could see the building where he worked. He worked at the Ministry of Truth. It was one of the only buildings he could see from his window that wasn't falling apart. He lived in London, the third largest city in Oceania. Years of wars and bombing, and not enough money to fix anything, meant that most of the buildings were falling down. He was a little boy when the wars started, so it was hard to remember what London had been like before it was part of Oceania. However, Winston was pretty sure it had been nicer then. The Ministry of Truth was a giant white pyramid that stood taller than all the other buildings. There were words printed in huge letters on the side of the building. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. There were more than 6,000 offices in the Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of Truth was in charge of all of Oceania's news, arts, and education. The Ministry of Peace was in charge of wars. The Ministry of Love was in charge of making sure everyone followed the law, forcefully if necessary. The Ministry of Plenty was in charge of the economy. Ironically, there were constant shortages of everything. The Ministry of Love was the scariest one. The building was massive, but it didn't have any windows. It was covered in barbed wire, and guards with machine guns stood outside at all times. Winston had never been there, and he hoped he never would. Winston made sure to put a big fake smile on his face before he turned around to face the telescreen. Even looking unhappy in your own apartment could get you into trouble. He skipped lunch at work so he'd be able to leave early, and the only food he had in the apartment was a small piece of bread that he needed to save for breakfast. Winston sighed. There was a large bottle of Victory gin in the kitchen. At least drinking would take his mind off being hungry. Even when the government didn't give you food, they always made sure you had plenty of alcohol. He poured a large glass of gin and drank it all in one big gulp. It smelled awful and tasted even worse, but it got you drunk quickly. That was the important thing. He followed the glass of gin with a Victory cigarette. They were also disgusting, but it was better than not having any cigarettes at all. Winston went back to the living room and sat down at a small table just to the left of the telescreen. Somehow this tiny corner of the room was just out of the sight line of the camera. When Winston sat at that table, nobody could see him. There was a drawer in the table. Winston opened it and pulled out an old-fashioned ink pen, a bottle of ink, and a small book with blank pages. The back of the book was red, and the front cover was swirled with a marble pattern. The blank pages were creamy and smooth. It was a beautiful old book. He had seen it in the window of a junk shop and knew he had to have it. Even though having books was discouraged, even books with no writing in them, Winston bought it. He sneaked it home inside his briefcase and hid it in the drawer of the table. Technically, having a book wasn't against the law. Nothing was actually against the law, but Winston knew that the police might kill him for having it anyway. The police could arrest you or kill you for anything they wanted. That was the problem with not having any laws. He had decided he would start keeping a diary. He knew it would be dangerous, but when he saw the beautiful book, he felt like it was something he had to do. He dipped the pen into the ink and paused. Once he wrote on the paper, there would be no going back. He pressed the pen onto the page and wrote, April 4th, 1984. Winston paused. He wasn't exactly sure if the date was right. Nothing with dates was certain with Big Brother. It might be 1984, but it could be also 1983 or 1986. He was pretty sure he was 39 years old, but he could be 37 or 40 or 42. Who was he writing this diary for? It had to be for someone in the future, someone who hadn't even been born yet. He was writing to tell that person about his life and his world. It would be evidence that he had existed. He suddenly felt paralyzed with the pressure of deciding what he should write. What was important? What would someone in the future need to know? He took a deep breath and began to write. I went to the movies last night. They were all war movies. One was very good. It showed a ship of refugees getting blown up. There was a part where a big fat man was trying to swim away. A helicopter swooped down and shot him full of holes. There was blood everywhere. The audience laughed so hard when that happened. There was another part with a boat full of little kids and a woman. She had a little boy about 3 years old in her lap, and he was hiding his face and scared. Anyway, the helicopter came down and dropped a bomb on them. All of them blew up in a huge explosion. When they showed the little boy's arm getting blown off and shot up into the air, it was hilarious. Everyone was clapping and cheering until one woman down in the prole section of the theater got upset and said they shouldn't have shown that in front of all the kids in the theater. The police threw her out. I don't think they beat her up or killed her or anything. Nobody cares what the proles think. The proles are members of the working class of Oceania. They make up 85% of the people in Oceania. Unlike members of the inner and outer parties, proles are not involved in politics. They are poor and spend most of their time working physically demanding jobs that suck all of their energy. Winston stopped writing. He had a cramp in his hand. He wasn't used to writing. He hadn't done it in a long time. He looked at the words he had written on the page. He didn't know why he wrote that. However, the act of writing helped another memory come into his mind. That memory was a more important one. It happened that morning at work. Winston worked in the records department at the Ministry of Truth. Winston and the other people who worked in his office were getting their chairs out of their cubicles and setting them up in front of the big office television. They were getting ready for the 2 minutes hate, just like every other day. That's when someone new came into the room. He had seen her in the hall at work before, but they didn't work in the same department. He didn't know her name. They had never spoken. Winston thought she worked for the fiction department, printing novels on the big machines. She often had oily ink on her hands when he saw her. She was about 27 years old, had thick dark hair, a freckled face, and quick movements. She wore a red fabric sash around her waist to show that she was a member of the Junior Anti-Sex League. Winston had disliked her from the first time he saw her. He didn't like women, especially young pretty ones. Young women were the most loyal members of the party. They were the first to turn people in if they even suspected the person might be doing something Big Brother wouldn't like. This girl seemed extra dangerous. Once, she looked at him as they passed one another in the hallway. Her eyes seemed to pierce right into him, and it had filled him with terror. Winston was scared she worked for the thought police and was only pretending to work in the fiction department. Maybe she was only there as a spy. He knew that probably wasn't true, but he still couldn't stand her. Another person was with the girl. It was a man named O'Brien. He was wearing black overalls and was also a member of the inner party. Members of the inner party had more power than people like Winston, who only belonged to the outer party. O'Brien had a very important job. When Winston and the others in his office saw O'Brien, the room went silent. O'Brien was a big man with a thick neck and a stern face. O'Brien was intimidating. However, there was still something charming about him. Winston didn't exactly find him likable. O'Brien was too scary to be likable, but he was charismatic. Other people wanted to be around him and wanted him to like them. It was too late for O'Brien to leave before the 2 minutes hate started, so he sat down in a chair next to Winston. The telescreen came on, and a horrible screeching sound filled the room. The giant face of a man named Emmanuel Goldstein filled the entire telescreen. Some of Winston's co-workers angrily yelled out, "Boo!" Others cried out in fear. Goldstein and Big Brother had created the party together a long time ago. However, Goldstein had disagreed with Big Brother. Big Brother saved Oceania and made Goldstein run away. Nobody knew where Goldstein went, but Big Brother said they should be glad he was gone. Big Brother was good, Goldstein was bad. Whenever anyone did something wrong, everyone knew that the person was secretly working with Goldstein. Everything bad in Oceania happened because of Goldstein. Goldstein's face was long and thin. He looked and sounded like a sheep. Just like every other day, Goldstein was yelling and screaming terrible, ridiculous lies about the party and Big Brother. His performance was so over the top that anyone should have been able to see that it was all an act, designed by Big Brother to direct their energy away from questioning him, but the audience believed every word of it. Goldstein was shouting about how they should go to war with Eurasia, go back to having freedom of speech, go back to letting the newspapers print any story they wanted, allow people to meet in groups without approval from Big Brother, and, worst of all, encourage people to think for themselves. Behind Goldstein's giant head, images of marching army men went back and forth across the screen. Within seconds, the audience had started shouting and screaming at the screen. The people of Oceania hated Goldstein more than anything. They hated him more than their enemies, Eurasia and East Asia. They hated him more than their boring jobs and the shortages of food. Everyone hated him, yet somehow there must still be people in Oceania who were tricked into following him. Every day the thought police found another traitor who had been secretly working with Goldstein, arrested them, then shot them in the head in front of the news cameras. It was a daily reminder that you could never be too careful. There were spies everywhere. You couldn't trust anyone. People in the party sometimes whispered about a book that Goldstein had written. There were secret copies of it all over Oceania. The book didn't have a title, but everyone knew it was real and dangerous. No one had ever seen a copy of it, but everyone in the party knew about it, even if they weren't supposed to talk about it. By the time a minute had gone by, the audience was out of control. People were screaming and crying so loudly that you couldn't even hear Goldstein anymore. People were rolling on the ground. They picked up things and threw them at the screen. The screen did not break. It was designed to stand up to abuse. Winston didn't want to feel angry, but the 2 minutes hate had a way of sucking you in. You couldn't help but join everyone else in yelling. After a while, you felt angry whether you wanted to or not. Winston's feelings were confused. Sometimes he hated Goldstein. Other times he hated Big Brother, the party, and everything about his sad, miserable life. Not that he would ever tell anyone about those feelings. Sometimes he could even take his hate and direct it toward a person, like the girl with the dark hair he saw in the hallway and didn't like. Fantasies flashed through his mind. He would like to beat her to death with a stick. He would like to rip off all her clothes, tie her up naked, and shoot her full of arrows. He would rape her, then cut her throat right when he came. Suddenly, Winston realized exactly why he hated the girl. He hated her because she was young and beautiful and would never, ever want him. Winston would never get to have sex with a girl like that, and it made him angry and sad. He wanted to put his arm around her waist, but the ugly, red, anti-sex league sash was in the way. Winston felt soft, warm feelings about her that he pushed away with violent thoughts. The 2 minutes hate was nearly over. The image of Goldstein on the screen kept changing. First it was Goldstein, then it was the face of a sheep, then it was the face of a Eurasian soldier. The yelling, screaming, hitting, and spitting became wilder and wilder until, finally, Big Brother's peaceful face came onto the screen, and everyone relaxed. Big Brother spoke quietly, and everyone was too exhausted and out of breath to hear him. They just sat in their chairs without any energy left. At last, the 3 slogans of the party filled the screen. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The audience began to chant, B, 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 short for Big Brother. To Winston, it felt like the chanting went on forever, but it was probably only about 30 seconds. The sound of it made him feel sick. During the 2 minutes hate, he had been caught up in the energy of the group. Now, however, when he thought of Big Brother, and it upset him. Winston still chanted along with everyone else. He knew that he had to participate or the thought police would come for him. Just then, he and O'Brien made eye contact. It was just for a second. Winston was scared. He was sure that O'Brien could see his feelings in his eyes. But something strange happened. In that second, O'Brien's eyes changed. Just for a second, O'Brien and Winston looked at one another and a shared thought passed between them. I understand how you feel. I feel the same way. It happened so fast that Winston wasn't even 100% sure he'd seen it correctly. When he looked at O'Brien again, the man's face looked just like everyone else's. Winston had experienced moments like this with people before, but they never happened again. Still, moments like this gave Winston the strength to keep on living. They gave him hope that there were other people who, like him, didn't like Big Brother or the party. There were people like him who weren't happy with the way things were and wanted them to be different. At the very least, that moment of eye contact had made Winston feel less lonely. His life was very, very lonely. Winston let the memory fade away and came back to the present. He was sitting at the little table where the telescreen couldn't see him, with the diary in front of him. He had been writing the whole time he had been remembering. He looked down at the page to read the words. He had written, "Down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother." He had written it over and over again until it filled up the whole page. Winston felt a jolt of panic in his stomach. He wanted to rip out the page so no one could ever see it, but he stopped himself. No matter what he did, it wouldn't matter. He had already broken the law just by thinking bad thoughts about Big Brother. The writing was only evidence of the crime. The thought police would know his thoughts and would come for him. They called it thought crime. He might be able to hide what he'd done for a while, but they'd eventually catch him. They would come for him at night. They'd pull him out of his bed, and no one would ever see him again. No one would know what had happened to him. He'd just be gone. Winston began to write again. "They'll shoot me. They'll shoot me in the back of the neck, but I don't care. Down with Big Brother. Down with Big Brother." He reread the words and was startled when someone knocked on his door. His heart was pounding. It was the thought police. They knew. They already knew. Winston made his face calm and expressionless, stood up, and went to answer the door.